by saying a huge thank you to Maria and the organisers for the event, and also to the other speakers for today. It's been really interesting listening to the different talks. I'm going to talk today about why audience is a key consideration in the teaching and the assessment of writing, and principally looking at the idea of how writing, the idea of audience shifts across different levels of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, and what evidence we've seen for that in the work of students and writing, particularly in timed written text. This comes from a corpus of exam texts that we worked with a few years ago, and also to learner reports that we had. So I'm also going to pick up on some learner voices on their views of how audience changes. The focus is on general English, but I'm talking about adult learners. I do think a lot of the principles and implications, and I'll be talking about some of those for teaching and assessing towards the end, apply across different levels, ages, purposes. So, you know, I think it is very wide, and I do think this notion of audience is a really, really central one. So just to start off about why I think it is a key factor. When we think about audience, it gives us an awareness of the purpose of the text, so we can think about why and what we want to do with a text. We're thinking about what we share with the reader, what their starting point is, where they're coming from, how much we have to explain to a learner in any given situation. It allows us to choose a voice, a way of presenting, in order to make our arguments as credible as possible. Again, you know, we will vary what we do depending on the type of decisions we make about the audience. And again, it helps us to develop the text in a way that we think will be easy for and interesting for our audience. One of the issues, and this was identified back in 1995 in the quote just down there, around the issue of audience, is very often when tasks are set, and this is often in the classroom or in examinations, the idea of audience is impoverished. But by what we mean by that is it's often very badly defined, it's ill-defined, which means that learners might struggle to engage with it, and we're not really teaching them to engage with it. Often writing is seen as a practice for language forms rather than communicative purpose. And one of the things I'd be arguing here is when we are teaching writing, when we are assessing writing, we need to think very carefully about it as a communicative purpose. So a model for this is from Badger and White, who talk about a genre process approach. And what this diagram here kind of brings up is the way the audience is linked to all other elements of writing. So if you think about the idea of the field, which is the type of text, the notion of what label would you put it? Is it an academic text? Is it a legal text? Is it a letter? Is it a letter to a friend? And again, and you've got tenor, which is the relationship between the writer and the reader. Those things are key to the idea of thinking about audience, but they're linked inextricably to the idea of the purpose, because when you're writing to a particular person, you know, you have a reason for doing that, and that will influence the subject matter and also the text. So all of these different elements run together. If you think about emailing a friend to rearrange a meeting versus emailing a manager to rearrange a meeting, because the nature of that relationship, the nature of the audience has shifted, so many of the other things shift in there. The purposes are essentially the same. The subject matter has shifted a bit, but the other one that's worth looking at is mode and channel, particularly thinking about what's been said this morning about sort of, you know, AI and tools. One of the issues we often have with students now is because of the way that they are used to interact using things like chat or, you know, SMS messaging or chat rooms. They're used to forms of discourse that are very different from some of the formal forms of discourse. So again, if you don't know what else to do, you will import some of those conventions into your writing. So I'm going to move on to talk about what the Common European Framework says about CFR levels and audience. So right down at the kind of the B1 levels and A1s, the focus is very much on the message rather than on what's being conveyed, not necessarily how well or appropriately for the audience. And this really starts to change at B2. This is the level which it becomes feasible to work or study in a foreign language. And crucially, that is in those domains of use that you are familiar with. So you're able to do things that you know about, that you're experienced with. If you move off of those kind of topics and areas, you'll start to struggle. What the framework here kind of identifies, and if I just sort of highlight a couple of these things here. At B2, we start to look at clear, coherent discourse. The other thing is the idea of thinking about effect on readers. So even at B2, which is, that's still a sort of intermediate as a kind of level, learners are being asked to begin to think about audience and how these things work. There's an emphasis of B2 plus. So when you get right to the top of that band, it starts to say, okay, now you're thinking about social discourse, the role of that text in society, in its relationships. And then when you get to in there also, it looks at the idea of marking relationships between ideas. Again, this idea of helping your reader through a text by focusing these things. This is important because one of the questions often get asked is what's the difference between B2, B2 plus and C1? And if we're going to go into it, C2. It can't simply be more complicated lexis or grammar. It must be about how language is deployed. And this is why discourse comes in, particularly at B2, and that idea of the new focus on discourse skills. And this is where audience becomes absolutely essential to learner performance. Okay. So moving on to C1. So at this stage, it becomes even more important. So again, it starts to talk about things like discourse community. So the design conventions. So what kind of texts are expected to be seen? How are these things expected to be organized within that community? So we're moving really into very strong notions of professional writing. And this idea of that the language is selecting appropriate formulations. So the language is appropriate not only to the text type, but to the purpose and the audience and the mode through which it's being done. As a kind of conclusion to this, I'm going to sort of quote Nick Saville from Cambridge ESOL, who in correspondence with Cyril Weir talked about, he said, well, actually, when you think about the shift to the higher levels of the Common European Framework, B2, C1, C2 above, what is central is discourse. It is discourse that is the key to unlocking these levels. And that means a focus on audience. So Common European Framework is useful. It's a model. When it was put together, it was a model that predicted performance. Again, the framework was not originally built on observations. It was built on the feedback of teachers, learners, educationalists. And what's kind of really happened in the last 20 years is people have started to examine and test the Common European Framework as a predictive model. So one of the things that was pulled together was this idea of the social cognitive framework. And this pulled together research to create a model of writing. And these are the processes that are identified within that. And, audiences runs all the way through it. In terms of these different stages, we've got macro planning, which is that initial gathering of resources, organization of a text, micro planning, thinking about the bit you are about to write. Translation is the actual act of writing, of taking it from your mind and putting it into the keyboard or put onto the page. Monitoring is just that. It's looking for accuracy and whether it is doing what it's supposed to be doing, it goes along, and then revising at the end. One of the key things to note is this is not an iterative process. We don't go from macro planning to organization to micro planning to revising at the end. We skip between these different steps when we're writing. Observations by researchers like Kellogg have identified that most proficient writers will start with translation. Again, if you think about when you write an email, very often you'll probably write the greeting and maybe a bit of the first line, before you actually start to think about how you're structuring what you're doing. So you kind of go from a translation, a micro planning, back into macro planning organization, then you're back into translation, you're monitoring as you go through. So this is a process, this is not a linear process. It skips about as we go through it. And this is a model for what we say writing comprises. A key question here when we're thinking about teaching and assessment is, how much of this do we expect learners to do at any given level? And to take that notion of audience, how much do we expect learners to be able to deal with the concept of audience and to address audience at the different levels? And that's really what I want to sort of talk about today. So again, I think we conclude we wouldn't expect an A student or a B on a framework level student to necessarily do all of these things in depth. We might expect some of them or even all of them, but in very controlled stages, varying degrees and with varying levels of consideration of audience. So that's the kind of the theory, if you like, and we'll move on to talking about kind of the research that we've done to sort of underpin some of this and to think about that idea of audience and how students, learners acknowledge it. So this is from a paper, the reference is at the end, and we were looking at meta discourse as an indicator of audience awareness and discourse awareness levels. We looked at B2, C1 and C2. I would say, it was with colleagues from another university, and including the late Stephen Bax. And we were looking to see about the evidence of discourse competence coming out. It was a large-scale study, which meta-discourse studies often are quite small. They often have quite a small corpus. We managed to work with Cambridge ESOL to get 300 scripts at each level, B2, C1 and C2, to look at those. And they were scripts that are all produced under timed conditions. I said they were from a Cambridge ESOL suite. We removed some of the discourse types, including stories and letters, because obviously the type of text you have in will change the meta discourse that is being used. So we did try to control the corpus a bit like that. If you're not familiar with the idea of meta discourse markers, and heaven knows it's hard enough to pronounce, it's the language that's used to express the author's awareness and management of discourse as process. So if you like, it's the nuts and bolts language that's holding. It doesn't convey the ideas. What it does is it structures the ideas or tells us something about what the writer thinks about the ideas. They are integral to achieving the outcome of the text. And Hyland's work, who we followed for the study, divided them into interpersonal and textual roles. Just as a quick amendment, he did later change his terms to interactional and interactive for good reason, but we stuck with these for the study. So I'll give you some examples of meta discourse. On the left, you can see the functions, and on the right, you can see the some example language of the kind of things that fall into it. So you can see, for example, with topic shifts, we've got things like in regard to, now, to come back to, well, stuff like that. We've got things like sequencing, finally, firstly, last to start with, and logical connectives, although, on the other hand, but, and so on. So it's all very familiar language to all of us, I'm sure, as we're going through. Okay, so it is the language used to manage a text, to convey the message. It often conveys how a writer feels about something. So we've got hedging, we've got emphatics, actually, certainly, these kind of things are used there. It can convey awareness of shared understandings. So, if I say obviously in my text, then I expect you to share that view. I might be more careful and use probably in some situations. particularly if I think the message that the audience is receiving is going to be difficult. It can be cultural as well. Again, this is one of the challenges working with meta discourse. Cultures use it in different ways. There's a very good study by Vigaro on for information letters in Italian and English, which identifies different ways in which it's used in those languages. Anyway, so having looked at 300 texts at each level, this is what we found. So, first of all, to draw your attention to the scripts, you'll notice B2 was an average of about 192 words, and C2 students were producing about 365 words per script. So perhaps unsurprisingly, scripts are getting longer with each level. Per script, we have about 34 for B2, and we have about 46 at C2. So again, longest texts suggest that we will have more meta discourse being used in there. However, when we sort of brought it to a comparison and looked at it proportionally, I found the B2s were on about 17, but the C2s had dropped to 12. So again, despite the fact that the texts were longer, proportionally, there was much less meta discourse in the text. Does that mean they're considering their audience less? This is just a representation of that graphically. So you can see the top line there, that's the markers per script. So you can see it rising up with the length of the script, whereas down in the dotted line, you can see it per 100 words, and you can see that dip from B2 to C1 to C2. So there is proportionally less meta discourse being used. So what that probably means is that our learners are being more selective about the authorial intrusion into their texts, how they could overtly structure. When we went in and looked at the actual items they were using and the functions we were using, we found a number of different things. First of all, the key one is that proficient writers often abandon my favorite phrases in the whole of English language teaching, the lexical teddy bears. A lexical teddy bear is the words that you kind of stick with from the beginning. So things like because and but and. You know them, they're easy to use, and you hang on to them. And B2 is full of them. But they decline as you go across the levels until you get to C2, where they start to be dropped in place of more complex markers like in spite of or although. Now, again, that's interesting because a lot of these more complex markers require more planning, whereas things like and but are additive. You can just basically stick them into the flow of the text to quickly change your orientation in there. If you're using the complex markers, then you have to plan it more. You have to think more about what you're trying to say and how you're trying to say it, and presumably for whom you're trying to say it. We also found that the Common European Framework's prediction that higher levels of proficiency will use a wider range of markers was also correct. So again, we found that across the different categories, the C1s and C2s were using a wider range of things. And again, that proportion fell. Fewer interpersonal markers, so that idea of the intrusions, the hedging, the kind of things like obviously, clearly, those very overt intrusions into the text began to disappear. And also things like, for example, pronouns, I, you, and so on. Again, suggesting that the learners at that stage, because they're engaging with a type of text that is an essay, are taking a more objective and personal tone in keeping with what would be more formal academic style or expectations. Again, it suggests that there is an awareness of audience that is developing in those learners. So let's move on. That's from research looking at meta discourse. Let's talk about what learners actually say about audience in writing. So this was a study that I did. I was working with students who were doing a timed essay. I had 12 participants because it was a lot of transcribing, so it took a long time. The students had 45 minutes to write an essay. I interrupted them every 2 minutes to ask them what they had been doing. You can imagine how annoying that gets as you go along. They were able to respond in English or in their L1, so try to keep the cognitive load as reduced as possible. And they were immediately interviewed straight afterwards. And the idea was to find out, what do the learners attend to when they're writing their essays? Are they thinking about the audience? So we had some post-task questions in addition to this. So these were 3 questions we asked immediately afterwards. So how do you prepare to write it? What do you think about after you completed the piece of writing? And when you're writing an essay, who do you think you are writing for? And again, that notion of audience was something we really wanted to explore and drill into. So when we talked to the students, the difference between C1s and B2s, we found in particular that the C1s preparing were thinking about the content, they were thinking about the organisation, and they were sort of breaking the task up into bits, whereas B2s, fewer of them were talking about those kinds of things. So again, you can already see that the C1s are thinking about that idea of, well, what goes into this? What do I need to do? What's the outcome? Who's going to be reading this? What did they think about when they completed a piece of writing? So in this case, we had the C1s who sort of looked at the language they'd used. They thought about the content, and they again went back to see whether they'd looked at the task a little bit. It was interesting, the B2s looked at the language and at the task assessment. That's quite interesting because the B2s are only actually thinking about whether they've completed the task at the end of the task, which is probably not the best place to be doing it, because what happens if you realise at that stage that you've done it wrong? And the question we asked them about, who do you think you're writing for? Again, the B2s were sort of someone important. They didn't have someone in mind, whereas the C1 said it's an assessor. Very practical, they're doing an exam, they're writing to an assessor. Or they're going for a general audience, we're going to be writing to young people, it's a newspaper article type thing. Or a teacher, and they've got a teacher in mind. So again, the C1s had a much more specific idea about who it was they were writing for, and therefore were tailoring their text much more towards that. This is from the actual reports. So what we did was looking at those interruptions and asking them what they were doing, break it into the essay writing into 3/3 of about 15 minutes each. Again, what's quite interesting there is this, in terms of generating content, the C1s do it at the beginning. So again, they're thinking right from the beginning about the content, and if you're thinking about content, you've got to think about, well, who's it for? So the B2s, not so much. They kind of start to think about content in the same foot, and that's that stage of, particularly they're getting to that point in when we're asking them a question, what are you doing? And they're thinking, I'm trying to think of some ideas, and they're doing that right in the middle of the text. So they kind of started off with the simple stuff, then they're struggling to think of ideas. Not a lot of discussion of audience, but in terms of the C1s, they did talk about audience in the kind of reports. So again, asked what they were doing. One said, I was thinking the idea of once someone reads to make it different from all the essays, what will make my essay look different to this audience? You know, what can I do, bearing in mind who this person is, that will make it stand out? Paragraph, so participant 11 was saying, well, okay, I'm going to write the second paragraph. I need to think about who's going to read this essay and what I'm writing this paragraph. So again, that notion, they're thinking about audience all the way through. And this is the marked difference between B2 and C1, similar to how the Common European Frameworks predicted it. And the C1 here says, you know, I'm thinking about how to make it easy for the reader. So again, they're thinking about that whole notion of the audience, who's reading it, you know, what are they likely to struggle with, what are they likely to need to sort of to know about these things. One of the things we looked at was searching for lexis. This was during the Think Aloud. And this was from the C1s. I found it really interesting. It was the appropriate word, trying to find the appropriate word. The C1s, the B2s would just write. They would sit down and write and write and write. The C1s would often stop and think, what is the right word in this situation for this audience? So again, that consideration, much, much stronger at the higher levels. And finally, monitoring language, thinking about the language you're using. Again, most people kind of, the B2s do it mostly towards the end. The C1s, much more likely to be doing it as it kind of goes along. Anyway, all of this, so we know from the Common European Framework is broadly correct, that audience is a key part of proficiency, particularly going from B2 higher levels into C1, into C2. It's something we have to train our learners for. It's something we have to bring into the classroom. I'm just going to spend the last 3-4 minutes just talking about what we do in order to help with that. So I think, first of all, we can bring in authentic texts. One of the reasons for doing this is textbooks generally are very bad at having authentic texts and bringing different voices. The texts are all what I tend to call airport lounge texts. They're kind of inoffensive, they're just bland, they don't have a clear genre to them. And we can use Halliday's concepts of field, tenor and mode. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we teach students field, tenor and mode, because that's something they don't need to know. But what we can do is put in varieties of questions when we put a text in front of students to sensitize them to a text. So, what kind of text is it? If you had to give it a label, what would you call it? What's the purpose? Who is writing to whom? Who's the audience? And what's the relationship between the audience? How do you know? And again, it's all looking at the language. Is it electronic text? Again, well, what's changed because of that? We might find, for example, if it's a text message, spelling probably doesn't so high. So we can use these kinds of questions, and we can use these questions right from the beginning, from quite early on, even in the A levels of the Common European Framework into the B levels. We can refine these questions, change them down, make them simpler, but we can make them a regular feature of text so that right from an early start, we are getting students used to the idea of thinking about audience. In terms of teaching assessment at all levels, we can specify target readers when we're giving a task for the classroom. We can give a text purpose. We can encourage students to discuss what that might mean in terms of requirements. So again, we should be overt about who we expect students to be writing for. We can think about processes that's appropriate for learners to engage with. Again, going back to that table, we clearly know that at sort of the lower levels, some of those features, at the sort of A1 and A2, organisation is fairly limited. So again, we have to do some of that for them. If you want to see some really good examples of how this has been done, have a look at the Shaw and Weir book, because they go through the different levels of Cambridge exams and about what the exams often do to support the writers so they're focusing on the correct processes at levels. This is one I believe in passionately. As teachers, when we ask students to write, we should respond to the content and its impact before we take on the considerations around language. Writing is a communicative act. We did something like this a few years ago, 20 years ago, while I was working in another university. And we said to teachers on the first draft, they were not allowed to make comments about grammar or vocabulary unless they couldn't understand what's being said. The first feedback of the draft had to be on the ideas, and the impact on the students was incredible. They couldn't believe that teachers had read what they'd written and actually and followed it. We can use extended role plays of writing role plays.
I have a question.
Sorry, I think someone not muted there. We can use extended written role plays. So again, getting learners to take on different roles of audiences, writing to each other. We can use genre process approaches of draft and redraft. Badger and White articles are a really good one for that. And we can get students to rewrite text for different audiences. Again, I mentioned the idea of email to a friend versus email to a boss, and get them to talk about the expectations of the audiences and think about how they would change it. At B2, we should always think about setting known audiences, people who they're familiar with, because again, it's the idea at B2 that you're working in context you know. We should recognize that writing and planning, that students will go straight in and start writing at B2. They don't do a lot of planning. There are some ferocious debates about whether planning actually helps at B2 or not. What I do know from observations of students is that they mostly start by writing and then start to think about it. So again, we need to think about, well, if the students need to feel secure, maybe we need to give them some tips about, well, here's how to write your introduction. Then you can pause and think about it. So they could, but if we want to do planning, we make it very rough at those levels. We don't expect detailed planning because they just won't engage with it. We need to encourage learners to think about how effective their piece of work has been. Again, going back to those questions that I posed about field tenor and mode, again, get them to analyze it. And that post-task consideration, what could they have said differently and why? Above that level, we can encourage tasks for a greater range of audiences. So again, pushing that boundary out, getting them to particularly things like problem solving. So again, writing to audiences that might be potentially hostile could be one way of, how do you smooth your message through? And tasks that have creativity. We should have that at all levels, but particularly problem solving and creativity at these higher levels, often where we ask them to bring multiple bits of information together in order to create a new text. And from Think Aloud, I often feel about interruption tasks, getting students to do some writing and then stopping them at pause, saying, what are you doing at this stage? And that kind of meta discussion about, how effective is what they've written so far? How are they gearing towards it? And again, that can lead to some very interesting discussions with learners. Okay, so here are some references from the talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. And it's been really nice to have to share this with you. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I am ready and willing to respond to some of those.
Thank you so much, Mr. Daniel, for your wonderful presentation. I'd like to apologize for the technical difficulties in the middle.
We're used to it. We've all been on Teams.
There always has to be that one person. Regardless, thank you for your presentation. And if there's any questions from our participants here, please feel free to ask them now, and I can read them off for you. Again, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
Dr. Daniel. It was interesting to see the outcome of your research is like the B1 think of the finishing of the task or things at the end. Why do you think it's because of the lack of language? They are more concerned of getting the grades and finishing the task, and well, the C1 are more proficient. They think first and plan first and then start writing.
It's a question very much around what's called the cognitive load. When you are writing at B2, your focus is on generating language, and it's very additive the way they do it. What they'll do is, if they're writing an advantage and disadvantage essay, they will write advantage 1, advantage 2, advantage, and then they'll run out of advantages. They go, okay, disadvantages, disadvantage, disadvantage, disadvantage. My favorite one was a student who was writing, and they said there are 3 advantages to this, and they wrote 1 and they wrote 2, and they went, I can't think of another one, so they crossed out 3 and wrote 2. Which is the way that you work at that level. It's very additive. It's a very crowded process because you're thinking and composing and doing it. So in theory, planning would help them, some form of planning, but very often I think they do engage more with the idea of they want to get in and write it because they're concerned very often about the words and getting enough words in. They worry about the kind of task and audience later on, and that's something we kind of need to work on with them to help them to develop through. We're not going to break that habit necessarily, but what we can do is start to get them thinking about it, ready for that shift into the higher level.
Yeah, because we always, we always face this because students keep on saying, oh, I have it in my first language, but I cannot transition it in English.
Yeah.
And although we go through all the pre-writing process, we go through brainstorming, we go through the outlines, and then they do the first draft and then the second draft. But despite all that process, they still lack content, or they have written content that is not relevant, they go off topic. So how can we just let them focus more on generating good content that is worthy of good grades and what we really ask for, rather just, filling up the pages there?
I think a kind of very limited model of planning. I think, saying to the students, you can write your introduction, get your introduction and get some pages down. You'll feel psychologically better at that stage. And then maybe at that stage say, right, now jot down your main ideas before you go any further. So it might give a bit of a kind of a sense of security, but we also know from writing that the act of writing often generates ideas itself. It happens with you, it happens with me. When you start writing, that's when you start to generate ideas. And that's what I mean by, we don't start with macro planning very often. What we often start with is by writing. And again, maybe that's the thing we need to sort of acknowledge with our B2s and that kind of low level, say, get them writing first, then the pause and get them to do it, because they'll have thought of some of the ideas will have come in, that process will have started. They might feel a bit more secure. It's worth trying, I think.
Yeah, we'll give it a try and see, because they're going through this process every level. So we start from the beginners level to intermediate and advanced, and still they keep on making that problem every time. They have still face that issues. So let's see if that helps, giving them chunks and letting them finish one part at a time, and that would help probably.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was an interesting thought. Thank you so much.
All right, we have a comment in the chat box. Amal is saying, I believe you have to take the writing piece by piece, what they call chunk, stop, scan. So yeah, have the beginning, middle, and end structure. And they have to model the beginning on the board, let them write their beginning and scan and support students as needed, provide a word back for students in need, and continue the same for the middle and again for the end.
Yeah, I think, very, very different ways of doing it. And, I think, you can provide models to learners of different ways of doing it. The concern I often have is, particularly the low level learners, is when they sit down in a timed exam or to do their homework, they will often jettison a lot of that stuff and just go back to that kind of additive model. And I think, their concern is very much about the idea of finishing it. So, I think the idea of we can teach from good habits, and I think what's been said there is good habits that we can teach and foster and show them. What we perhaps can't expect is necessary that those will feed through until they've got that kind of stronger grip of the language. There's less cognitive space being used to do that kind of micro planning, and they've got the sort of resources to do it. So again, I think interventions are often quite a good way of doing it. So I mean, again, I would endorse any kind of plan that teaches good habits to learners. Again, I think we have to be a little bit realistic about what we will get back from the learners, but they will have impacts later on, because if you taught the habits and you reinforce the habits, when they get to the stage to be able to do it, they will be able to do that.
Marwa. Right, thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. We really appreciate you joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's been a delight and an honor to have a chance to be here today. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye for now.
All right. Thank you once again, Mr. Daniel. And now we move back into our presentations for the day. Our next presenters are, I'd like to welcome back Miss Maria, Dr. Marwa, Miss Ocean, and Miss Lamia. Miss Maria Zahir is a PhD candidate and holds masters in applied linguistics, and is a recipient of awards for distinguished teaching, research, and workshops. Her research interest includes action research, digital teaching, and innovative learning. Ms. Ocean Danish is a PhD candidate and holds an MA in TESOL and MRES in TESOL. Her research interests are intercultural communication, influence of L1 on L2, reading and writing for academic purposes. And Ms. Lamia Barakat holds a master's in teaching for social justice, and she's been awarded a Fulbright foreign language teaching assistant, FLTA for short, scholarship. And Dr. Marwa is an assistant professor of linguistics at ISLAIB, Jendouba University, Tunisia. She holds a PhD in linguistics from Higher Institute of Languages, Tunis, at the Carthage University in Tunisia. She's also a Cambridge English certified teacher trainer. Her special interests are experimental psycholinguistics and English language teaching. I would like to give the floor to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Fawaz, for introducing us and having me on the platform to be able to present. And thank you, Ms. Maria, for the opportunity. I am going to begin the presentation by telling you all about our about our research. It's like a brainchild for us, and it's quite important and it's very special. So what we'd like to do here is that we are looking at writing. We're focusing on writing here. So the recent evolution of Saudi English is a new variant within the World English framework that has motivated this research. The presenters, like all of us today, are, we're going to share our findings related to 3 frequent errors made by ESL and EFL learners, which is namely article omission, misuse, and substitution, and the implication of English language classrooms and the implication of this in the English language classroom in the Saudi context. Now, there are 5 areas that we have focused on. Number 1 is the English orientation program. The university that we teach at, we don't have a normal preparatory year, but those are in fact called as orientations. And each orientation has focuses on different level of students, different writing skills, different tasks. However, they are all based on separate levels. We are also going to look at the definiteness of English articles, namely, we're focusing on the and. This entire thing is based on second language acquisition, so that's also something that we're focusing on. And the most important, the biggest jewel on the crown is Saudi English, which is a very recently developed and developing variant. And to do the entire process, to undertake our research, we used forced elidation, which was in the form of tasks where students were required to they were required to add the and, and we basically analyzed them on the basis of the 3 variants that we're looking at. Now, let's talk about a little bit about Saudi English. Saudi English is an emergent variant, like I just mentioned, and like the term says, it's an Arabicized version that is spoken in the Middle East. I would probably say in the Middle East and Arab countries. Contrary to other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia has no history of British colonization and thus belongs to the expanding circle of English, not the outer circle, which has been claimed by Kachur. American English exists the most significant influence in Saudi Arabia, and we're just going to show you this in the next slide now. If you see, Kachur here provides a proper virtual representation and inference to support the statement that was made earlier. I'm not sure if you were able to see all three of the circles, but from what you can understand here is the inner circle is what we can say the native land when it comes to the language. So that basically consists of the 5 native English speaking countries, which are US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The out circle that we call here, or that Kashu has mentioned here, are the countries which have some kind of history of colonization or influence of these countries in the inner circle. For example, we've got Bangladesh, we've got Ghana, we've got India, we've got Kenya, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and Zambia. These countries fall under the outer circle, which means they've had history or they have had the influence of the inner circle, due to which English has been, I would say the word, embedded in their culture as well. Now, if you look at the expanding circle are the countries which do not have any direct link of colonization per se, if we use historical terms, with the inner circle. They are influenced because of the growing, I would say, globalization, but and they don't have a direct connection with the inner circle. In such, when it comes to the expanding circle, we have countries like China, Egypt, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, Korea, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, the USSR, and Zimbabwe. So these countries fall under the category of the expanding circle. Now, to give you a more clearer introduction, we are going to discuss this in a little more great detail. So the article system is a grammatical and a functional category available in some languages. Now here we're focusing basically on the language use within Saudi English. The English language has articles the and the zero article, which is clearly there. So these articles, as these English articles as grammatical words are most commonly used in the language, and yet their use is surprisingly complex and difficult for both native and non-native speakers of the language. So it's not just specifically for those who do not belong to the inner circle. Now, the difficulty here arises is when the articles come into the picture. So the difficulty of article used in English arises for speakers of L1 languages. The term L1 here means the first language that lacks the use of articles or article-like morphemes. The Arabic language only shares the availability of the definite article with the English language. This is something that is important to remember. So the Arabic language is described as big as AR plus because it uses the definite article al. So this is what we have been looking at. Let's move ahead to the literature survey. We've done a lot of reading, we've done extensive research, and what we can see from whatever we have had so far is that a great amount of second language acquisition research has reported that acquisition of the English article system is problematic for learners of English as a second language, which is L2, especially for those learners whose first language lacks the article determiners, or sorry, article system or determiners. The problems that are faced by L2 learners of English have with the use of English article fall into different kind of linguistic categories and types, which demonstrate various error patterns and come from a variety of sources. The acquisition of articles in L2, which is second language English, notices that adult L2 English learners omitted articles in both definite and indefinite linguistic context and incorrectly substituted one article in the context of the other. And this is something that we have also noticed in our own research, that there have been omissions, or if not, then there have been substitutions, especially for the word a or and that it's not before late stages of acquisition that adult L2 English learners reach non-native-like performances on articles and determiners in general. That is, if they ever. From what we have seen in the literature review and from what our own research shows, there are a couple of factors that are responsible for the use and the overuse, or might just be able to scrape them off completely. Now let's look at the rationale. There are several reasons why Saudi English was chosen most significantly. Saudi Arabia has seen a significant increase in the number of English speakers in the country in the last 40 years from the standpoint of English globalization. I would not say that prior to those 40 years there was no trace of the language, but the increase can be seen from the last 40 years. According to Al-Taibi, the percentage of educated English learners increased from 40% of the population in 1972 to 98.7% in 2012, which we can say is a huge leap towards the use of language. This research examines various variations in traits that are most identified in Saudi ESL students in the orientation program, as there were few instances of research in this context. So research has been done prior, looking at different areas and different groups of people, but for this one, we focused on our students in the orientation program. Now, this was the history and the background of what we decided to do. I would like to give to your attention on the research questions now. To be able to understand this in a much better context, we put together 3 research questions. Number 1, do years of experience correlate with variations in the use of English articles in Saudi English? This was a question that we initially started thinking about because like a language learner, everybody requires some kind of time to be able to use the correct articles if it's not your own language. The next one, to what extent does the substitution and omission of English articles and the reflect on the use of L2 or second language? And finally, does the influence of L1 affect the use of English articles in L2? These were some of the questions that we really wanted to understand and look at, and were able to put together through our research. Now, I would like to ask Ms. Maria to discuss the rest of our research. The research context and our findings will be discussed by her.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ocean. And I would like to start here by saying that we are co-researchers and we are working together on a couple of other research papers as well. And this is something that we have done recently. So we thought of sharing with the attendees today. So following our research questions, I would like to tell you, you might have got an idea because we're talking about Saudi English. So our research context, as Ms. Ocean mentioned earlier, is orientation, English orientation, or a preparatory year program where students come from 10th grade and join the university. So they are first year university students. So here the participants were 55 native Saudi female students aged from 18 to 22. Why we took just native Saudis? Because we're talking about Saudi English as an emerging variety, rather any other Arab nationals in our research. Yes, the location was Saudi Arabia, and forced elicitation task, that was a gap fill. And when they had a multiple choice where you had to select between the, or an. And Common European Framework reference of language was advanced orientation level, which goes from B to C1. I think Dr. Daniel mentioned about this earlier, so you kind of have an idea of the levels now. So the research that how did we move on with it? So it was a quantitative analysis done through coding the distinctive features of Saudi English. No controlled or experimental group. So we went on in our classrooms and we gave them as a activity or a task to do. So they were not even forced with any kind of thought of that they're being assessed or anything. So it was a casual, informal kind of a handout that was given to them in the classroom to do it. And systematic data analysis on the use of omission, misuse, substitution of indefinite articles, the, and, and. So when we went on analyzing, we removed and because it was very easy for the learners to, because they know we use and before the, before the vowels. So vowels, yeah. So we removed that when we started analyzing that, and we left with a and the. Moving forward, there came the analysis and the results. We matched them with the years of experience correlated with variation of English articles. Like we know, with as proficient we become in the language, we assume that the errors would be, we make less errors, like Dr. Daniel also mentioned earlier. But surprisingly, for us, using of specific language element was different. So we had years of experience from one, years of experience here means to the exposure of the language of English, especially. So some of the students were taught in the medium of instruction was English, but some still came from Saudi as Saudi or Arabic language as their medium of instruction. So some we had minimum years of experience of exposure to language from 1 to maximum 15. So the omission of articles was interesting. It was a and the here, if you can see. So the minimum of 1 did 0, omission of articles or the or and can you see how the maximum number or more experience did more omission from 7 to 8, and the overuse of was 4 and 32. So it was surprising that the minimum were using less errors than the maximum exposure of language. I think this is something that I learned, that the use of articles, no matter what language it is or what second language you're exposed to, you are, this is the last acquired element of English language. And how much proficient you become, you tend to make more mistakes. That's what our research found, rather than making less mistakes in use of articles. So the means were, as you can see, the omission of article the was more with the years of experience, and the overuse was less in regards to the years experience, where the omission of article was overuse was more. So there's a variation here. Although it was a forced elicitation task, we tend to expand our research looking at their writings and see if we can see the same patterns in our further research. So the correlation between the years of experience and the misuse of article of and the, so misuse of article was less instead of the. And then again, the correlation was 9.968. And then the substitution of both and the with the years of experience was 331, then to -336 overuse of both articles in the. Like we said, we mentioned that the article the is one of the overused ones because of Arabic language, and they have this al in, like we say, we don't say just riyad, we say al riyad. So al means the, basically, when you translate in English. So that was interesting to find that there was more use and even substitution of article the and instead of any other article. So the definiteness of article the was more prominent, and overuse of here you can see the years of experience, which had less years of experience, just 1 year, were making, overuse of more than the. Followed by the correlation between the years of experience. You can see the overuse of the was less, and the substitution was more of the here. And it was interesting to see how the evaluation of the results as we moved on with the research. So the set of results in the previous research studies investigating definiteness in Saudi students of English, accordingly, the definiteness in Arabic entails using the prefix al for the definite context and bare nouns of indefinite context. Therefore, it could be suggested that the participants of the present study associate both the and a with definiteness. So probably the al is a and the for them. That's why the overuse or the substitution is taking place. So here are some of the conclusions that we came from our research. There are also cases where al is used as necessary article, and the rare cases that article a could be added to the noun to indicate indefiniteness. They could explain the overuse of substitution article a and the, which clearly displays a case of language interference. The conclusion is lined with Al-Hosseini et al. In 2016. Here are some of the references that some of them we couldn't cover all, but yes, these are some of the references that we went through our literature survey when we were doing our research. So yes, that's pretty much it. Now we are open for any questions. The rest of our co-authors have also joined. Ms. Lamia Barakat has just joined us, and Dr. Marwa is there with us. They couldn't join us earlier, but she just joined us right on time. Welcome, Ms. Lamia. Hello? Hello? Okay, I think she's not there. Well, Ms. Ocean and I are open for any questions. You can type in the chat box before we start the next session. Okay, we have an interesting question in the chat box saying Egypt was colonized.
Yes, there's a very interesting one. Egypt was colonized by British, so I think it should belong to the outer circle. I'm practicing my critical thinking here. It's a very well critically thought question, absolutely. Yes, Egypt was colonized, and that is very true. But according to Kashu, it comes under the outer circle. Unless and until we can go and talk to him about it, I think we'll stick to that.
Amal, you can collaborate with the research. Amal is suggesting how does one take part in such research with others. Well, all four of us are colleagues and we're working in one place and in the same university. But if you wish to contact us, we have our contact details in the following slide. You can contact us, and if we are able to collaborate with you, we are happy to collaborate with the researchers. Any questions related
to questions?
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much.
Amal is in Saudi, so Amal, we are in Riyadh.
Amal is in Riyadh as well. Great. Okay, Daniel has a question for us. For Saudi learners, what might be some of the implications of teaching?
Okay,
Ms. Maria, we have a question from Dr. Daniel. For Saudi learners, what might be some of the implications for teaching?
I think we as teachers, we need to really highlight the fact and tell and share our research with teachers, showing them that the difference, how the more proficient they're becoming, why there is overuse. They need to really identify the definiteness and indefiniteness and tell them to understand it's not Arabic and they cannot transfer the same thing in their L2, and exposing them to the language more, giving them examples in context, letting them use in the free writing would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think, I'd like to add to this, it's also that learners don't realize sometimes, because our communicative English is, I would say, is more proficient as compared to this, to the writing. So sometimes when they make errors in their writing, it's difficult for them to comprehend because they don't really make that error when they're speaking. So I think that when teachers are giving feedback, that is also something that they need to look at, that if that although their spoken language might be good, and they're well proficient, because speaking develops faster than writing. Writing is also something that needs proper feedback when it comes to L2 students.
Yes, and like I said, we just looked at the 4 solicitations. So probably when we start analyzing and adding the aspect of writing in it and see if the writing has the similar features, so maybe our research might take a different shape and may come up with different answers with it.
Absolutely. We have 2 collaboration related questions, Ms. Maria. There's somebody called HP. Can we please have your full name? Who works in Bahrain and would be interested in doing a comparative study. And we have Fanmilia, I guess. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name in the wrong way. Who's asking if you're open to collaborating with people of other countries.
Yes, we are happy to collaborate, but again, we have lots of collaborations in hand, but we are open in future. So probably you can get in touch with us and we can
Absolutely.
see. And Dr. Marwa is in the chat box. She just had her surgery, so she cannot speak well, but I would like to read her comment there. Exposure to feedback on the right time will help the students to further detect the mistakes. And yes, for me, timely feedback is very important, because if you delay the feedback, for me, it's like justice denied. If some teachers just don't give feedback at all, and some teachers just delay it till they are already writing the next piece of work. So please do justice to your students and give them the feedback when they receive it, so they can identify. And something that I continuously use in my classroom is highlighting, color coding the text. So seeing why do they really need to understand why did they make this mistake. So probably you can have a color code for red, yellow, green, blue, where there was an omission, a different color for substitution, and a different color of overuse. This is also a good way to practice in your classrooms that makes students really identify what kind of errors they're really making. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Dr. Marwa, for joining us. And although you're not feeling the best, thank you for being available on the chat box. Okay. I think there are no further questions. Yes. I will stop sharing my slides here. Our next presenter is going to join us in 5 minutes. So we will hold on and we will see her soon. Thank you so much, Ms. Maria, for giving me the opportunity as well to present our paper alongside you. And I look forward to our next presenter now. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you, Ms. Ocean, and others. Bye for now. So we'll just hold down for 5 minutes and the next presenter will join soon. Thank you.